Imagine you are a newly independent nation tasked with feeding hundreds of millions of people, but your farms are fundamentally failing. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to dig into how India, facing an absolute crisis, managed to feed its rapidly growing population and completely transform its economy. It's an incredible story of technology, policy, and immense change.
Here is our roadmap for today. First, the agricultural crisis. Second, enter the Green Revolution. Third, the two phases. Fourth, reaping the benefits. And finally, number 5, risks and government solutions. Let's jump right in.
Section 1. The agricultural crisis. Stagnation to crisis.
To understand the cure, we really have to understand the disease. Right at independence, a staggering 75% of India relied entirely on agriculture. Think about that. 3/4 of the whole population. But despite having so many hands working the land, agricultural productivity was just incredibly low. We're talking old technology and almost zero infrastructure for the vast majority of farmers. It was basically traditional farming clashing with a massive new necessity. Traditional farming was completely at the mercy of the monsoon rains. If the rains failed, the nation starved, plain and simple, because almost nobody had access to proper irrigation. The new necessity was obvious. They urgently needed a modernized, highly productive system that relied on steady, controlled irrigation instead of just hoping for good weather.
Because of this long-term stagnation, the nation literally couldn't sustain itself. India was living ship-to-mouth, heavily reliant on the United States just to meet its basic, everyday food requirements. And, for a newly sovereign nation, relying on foreign powers for your next meal, that is a remarkably vulnerable position to be in.
Section 2. Enter the Green Revolution, breaking stagnation.
So, how do you permanently break decades of agricultural stagnation? The answer was the Green Revolution, and at the center of it all was a massive technological breakthrough, high-yielding variety, or HYV seeds. These were specially developed seeds, mostly for wheat and rice, that were designed to produce a massively larger increase in food grain compared to traditional, older seeds.
But look, these weren't just magic beans. You could just throw them in the dirt and hope for a miracle. It was a very specific recipe that required exact ingredients. Step 1, you need the HYV seeds. Step 2, you absolutely have to apply the exact correct quantities of chemical fertilizers and pesticides. And step 3, a regular, highly reliable supply of water. If you didn't have all those inputs in the right proportions, it simply didn't work.
Section 3. The two phases. Spreading the tech.
Now, a shift this big doesn't just happen everywhere all at once. Because this new recipe was expensive, requiring real money for chemicals and irrigation, the revolution rolled out in 2 distinct phases. In phase 1, roughly the mid-60s to the mid-70s, this expensive tech was mostly restricted to affluent states that already had capital and water, like Punjab, Andhra Pradesh, and Tamil Nadu. And it was mostly about wheat. Then, in phase 2, from the mid-70s to the mid-80s, the tech successfully spread to a much larger number of states and started boosting a wider variety of crops.
Section 4. Reaping the benefits, economic impact.
Okay, so it's one thing to grow more food, but it's another entirely to transform an economy. The key concept here is marketed surplus. If a farmer grows more food but just eats it all with their family, the broader economy doesn't really change. Marketed surplus is the portion of the crop that actually gets sold in the market, so the family keeps a small pile to survive and the massive, newly grown surplus gets loaded up and sold.
And selling that huge new surplus, it triggered a fantastic chain reaction. First off, India finally achieved total self-sufficiency in food grains. Second, because the market was flooded with food, the price of grains dropped compared to other consumer items. That right there is absolutely crucial. Cheaper food was a massive win for low-income groups who are spending most of their money just trying not to starve. And finally, it allowed the government to build up vital emergency buffer stocks to protect against future shortages.
You can just imagine the immense shift in national pride. Picture a confident Indian farmer sitting tall on a modern tractor, waving off a foreign official standing next to imported food sacks, saying, "After Green Revolution, who is interested in your offer?" It completely cemented the reality that India had achieved self-sufficiency. They were no longer at the mercy of America or anyone else just to survive.
Section 5. Risks and government solutions. Balancing equity.
Of course, reality is always a bit messy, and every great tech shift has its hidden costs. This revolution introduced a massive risk of economic disparity. Big, affluent farmers could easily afford all those expensive seeds and fertilizers, so they raked in the lion's share of the profits. But small, poor farmers, they couldn't afford the inputs. Worse, these new HYV crops were much more vulnerable to pest attacks. A small farmer who gambled on the new tech risked losing absolutely everything in a single bad season.
To stop this from tearing the agricultural sector apart, the government had to step in. They mitigated those massive risks by heavily subsidizing fertilizers and offering low-interest loans directly to small farmers. That crucial intervention meant poor farmers could actually afford the tech, ensuring the Green Revolution wasn't just a revolution for the rich. But that government intervention brings us right to a highly debated policy question, one that economists are still arguing about today, long after this technology became the total norm.
Let's look at both sides impartially. Critics argue we should phase subsidies out. They say the purpose was served, the tech is widely adopted, and now these subsidies are just a massive financial burden on the government that ends up disproportionately helping the fertilizer industry and already rich farmers. Supporters, however, argue we have to keep them. They point out that farming is still inherently risky, and most poor farmers simply won't survive without that financial safety net. Removing them, they say, completely violates the nation's goals of economic equity.
It's a fascinating dilemma without an easy answer. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought. When we look at any massive leap forward, how do we actually balance the drive for immense technological growth with the ongoing, fundamental need for social equity? The Green Revolution solved a literal crisis of survival, but the questions it raised about fairness, we're still trying to answer those today. Thanks so much for joining me, and keep exploring.